Welcome to the presentation on vocabulary intervention for deaf and hard of hearing students. I am Shirin Antia from the University of Arizona. Funding for this project is supported by the grant from a U.S. Department of Education, Office of Special Education Programs, and the work is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives, International License. So what will you learn today? What I'm going to cover is the importance of vocabulary learning, connections between vocabulary and literacy, really reading comprehension, components of good vocabulary teaching, and an effective vocabulary intervention program that we have tried out here at the University of Arizona as part of our work at the Center on Literacy and Deafness. So the first question that we need to ask ourselves is, why is vocabulary learning really important to deaf and hard of hearing children? Why should we teach vocabulary in the first place? One of the things that we're often taught in language development courses is that children pick up vocabulary from their environment. But vocabulary is a predictor of reading comprehension for both deaf and hard of hearing children and hearing children. So for all children, the size of their vocabulary and the depth of their vocabulary is a predictor of reading comprehension. You'll remember from Dr. Lederberg's presentation on the simple view of reading that reading comprehension has two main components. There's the word decoding or recognition and language comprehension. To understand what's read, children need to understand the language in which they're reading. So decoding words into speech or sign is necessary, but it's not sufficient. If they decode the word, but it's not part of their lexicon, not part of their own personal vocabulary, they're not going to be able to understand what they read. We have lots of evidence of delay with deaf and hard of hearing children, and typically the research is going to show that they are about one standard deviation behind hearing children, or maybe at the low end of average. Now, that doesn't mean that every single deaf or hard of hearing child is below average in vocabulary learning, but many of them are, in fact, delayed. So we'll pause for a minute and have you write down the three major reasons that you think that deaf and hard of hearing children are at risk for learning age-appropriate vocabulary. So pause the video, write it down, and then we'll come right back. Okay, so here are my reasons that I can give you for vocabulary delays, and we can talk about this on the discussion board. There's generally deaf and hard of hearing children grow up in an impoverished vocabulary environment. And again, remember that nothing is, equal for all children. Some are going to grow up in not impoverished vocabulary environment. But the main reason that they have vocabulary delay is they have an inability to access the vocabulary, right? So if they are oral children, then the auditory environment may not allow them to access vocabulary. Even if they're good hearing aid users or cochlear implant users, they might still have trouble because they can't always overhear other people's conversation. If they're in noisy environments in classrooms, they may not get all this new vocabulary. If they're signing kids, they're often engaging with adults who don't have a large sign vocabulary themselves, right? Parents, as well as teachers, may not be using this very rich sign vocabulary. And one of the reasons is that they may not have the large sign vocabulary themselves, but the other reason is that there is a phenomenon that Greenberg calls linguistic overprotection. And what that means is we often don't use advanced vocabulary because we think that children will not understand it. And it's true, we should be careful about, talking over children's heads all the time. But at the same time, if we only use very simple, very basic vocabulary, then that's all they're ever going to learn. So there has to be a balance between what the children can comprehend and using vocabulary that's a step above what they can easily comprehend. So this slide really shows you the cycle between vocabulary and reading comprehension. So you could see that what it shows is the vocabulary leads to language comprehension, which assists with reading comprehension. And then the more children read, the better their vocabulary grows, the more their vocabulary grows. So reading comprehension leads to really a love of reading, we hope. And the more children read, the better their vocabulary growth. So, and it's sort of all tied together. So it is really an important piece of literacy as well as of language, but the kind of vocabulary we're going to talk about today is really related to their literacy. So here's my take on Vocabulary Instruction 101. We're going to talk about what does it mean to know a word, what words should be taught, how many words can children learn, and what are the components of good vocabulary instruction. And then I'll talk a little bit about the study that we have just completed on successful vocabulary instruction. So, what does it mean to know a word? We can think of this hierarchical way of knowing words. First, the child might recognize the word. Oh, yes, I've seen or I've heard this word before. I have a vague idea about what it means. It relates somehow to bats. That's the unit that I'm going to talk about, so it's on my mind. But that's just recognition, and that's not sufficient for children to understand the word. Then we have comprehension, where the child can say, yes, I understand the word. But above comprehension is expression, where the child can either say or sign the word when it's appropriate. And then finally, really expression is when they can say and sign the word in a limited context. And then I think of generalization as saying, I can use the word really appropriately. I can pull it from my memory when I need to use it to talk about a particular topic. And that's a little bit more than just being able to express the word when, for example, I show a child a picture or he's looking at a book. So that generalization comes into writing. It will come into being able to understand the word when it's being used in a different book. So it's a lot more than just being able to express the word. If we go even further, we can talk about the narrow knowledge of a word in one context only. And then we can talk about, above that, rich, decontextualized knowledge. So they can have a narrow knowledge. That means they can only use it when they're talking about the book that you've read to them where the word occurs and you've taught the word. Or they can go and be talking about it when they are writing about a different subject altogether. They can give you a word meaning. They know that it can be used in multiple contexts. And then finally, you get to where children understand that there are multiple meanings to a single word. They begin to understand figurative use of the word, and so on. Okay? Okay, so that's what it means to know a word. And you can see there's so many levels of knowing a word. Then we come to, what words should be taught. So starting, you could see that I've made this into a pyramid that shows, what are the highest frequency words, and then going, the pyramid narrows down. So tier 1 words, which are the base of the pyramid, are high frequency words. They're basic words that most children will learn from interactions with adults and peers around them. They often don't need to be taught. One caution, though, that for deaf or hard of hearing children, many of those words may in fact need to be taught because some children come to school with a highly impoverished vocabulary for a variety of reasons that I won't go into here, but I'm sure that many of you who are teachers already know most of those reasons. Then we can talk about tier 2 words that are reasonably high frequency, but are not limited to a specific domain. So tier 2 words are mature words, but they're not particular to a specific subject. So these are words like remarkable, huge, delicious, twig. You could see they're beyond the very basic words. They may not be words that we use in everyday conversation all the time, but they're really important words to understand what's written in a book. And then finally, we come to tier 3 words that are low frequency words and highly specific for a specific domain, for a specific subject. So these might be words like continent or peninsula or nocturnal. And these words also have to be taught, but we often can teach them while we're teaching subject matter. In fact, a lot of times learning subject matter means learning these particular words because they have very specific definitions and very specific meanings. So what we typically talk about is going to tier 2 words if we're going to teach words, because we assume that tier 1 words will be learned through general interaction. Tier 2 words can be taught, and tier 3 words will need to be taught, but they can be taught through subject matter. Again, I'll put back the caution about deaf and hard of hearing students. We shouldn't assume that tier 1 words are going to be known. We should check it out. So our next slide asks you how many words, how many new, so I want you to do another exercise. I want you to think about how many new words your students are learning every week. I want you to take a few minutes and make an estimate for your top performing student and also estimate that for your lowest performing student. And keep those numbers with you because we'll talk about them now and later. So how many words do children learn? The estimates go from 1 to 7 words per day. The most common estimate is 7 words per day, but that's an average for all kinds of learners. There are also other estimates that say for low vocabulary learners, children who have difficulty learning vocabulary, they might learn 1 new word a day. And for the children at the high end, the good vocabulary learners learn about 3 new words a day. But you could still see that we have, children learning then 15, 18 new words a week. So children learn a lot of new words in the course of their life. In fact, there is research that's been done that shows that deaf and hard of hearing individuals continue to learn vocabulary. Actually, for all of us, vocabulary learning is one of those things that continues throughout life. So now we get to what are the components of good vocabulary instruction. And here I'm going to get you notice my little cloud, the little thinking cloud, that says that you get to do something. So I want you to think about how you teach vocabulary to the kids that you work with, to the deaf and hard of hearing children you work with. And if you're not working with deaf and hard of hearing children, then think about how you teach vocabulary to the children you work with and what strategies you think are most effective. And we'll pause and give you time to write this down. So pause the video and take some time to write that down, and then we will talk about that on the discussion board later on. So here are what I think of and the literature thinks of, well, the authors of the literature think of, are the components of good vocabulary instruction. So I'm drawing from quite a lot of literature as well as our own experience in teaching vocabulary. First, you've got to choose the appropriate words. And as I said before, it's nice to choose tier 2 words because those are the ones that need to be taught to most children. But for some children, you may need to choose tier 1 words. We generally have been working on saying, well, choose the words that you think the child will not know, or just assess and see if the child knows the words or not. Don't teach words that they often express. Teach words that are not in their lexicon. Connect the words to a theme, because connecting the words to a theme allows teachers to work in vocabulary and a content area at the same time. And it also helps children create a schema for the entire concept. So we like to connect vocabulary to a theme. We think that it's important to provide child-friendly definitions in everyday language. And I'll provide you with some resources at the end of this presentation as to where you can get these child-friendly definitions. But it's important, we thought, to give definitions because children often are just expected to figure out words from the context, and they can't do that. And just even giving them examples, they often can't do that. They also need to know how a definition is different from a word. I mean, that's part of content learning, especially in the later grades. So we do encourage giving child-friendly definitions. We don't encourage, particularly for young children, having them look up dictionary definitions because those are not child-friendly. You do need to provide repetition. It's not enough for children to hear or see the words one time. Some children will pick it up from one exposure only, but most children will not. And then we also think that it's very important to get students to use the words themselves. Again, I don't think that exposure is enough for children to learn the words. We've been learning that from our work with the vocabulary instruction. So let's talk about vocabulary instruction for young deaf and hard of hearing children. This is based on our work at the Center on Literacy and Deafness, which is a big research center involving a lot of universities. What we did is we adapted an intervention called Paved for Success by, you see the authors there. I'm not going to try and repeat the words because I don't know how to pronounce Schwanenflügel, by Hamilton and Schwanenflügel. We designed it as a supplemental intervention for deaf and hard of hearing children in grades K through 2. It's centered around a content area. We chose science, but it could just as easily be centered around social studies, for example, or any other content area that's interesting to the children you work with. And what I'm going to do is sort of walk you through the steps of developing a unit plan and then show you some results. So our this intervention consists of 4 components. We call the first component fast mapping, and I'll explain that in a minute, interactive book reading, conversation with adults, and extension activities. So when you plan a vocabulary unit, we suggest that you choose the theme. This is how we've been doing it. We choose 2 related books, one of them being an expository book. These are not books that the children are going to read. These are books that you are going to read to the children, so we don't really have to worry about whether they have decodable words or not, which is why we choose expository text, because many young deaf and hard of hearing children are not exposed to expository text, which has a totally different structure than narrative text. But for the 2 books, we often choose one narrative and one expository. We select target words from the books. It's much easier than starting with target words and then looking for the books to contain the target words. We tried that, and it didn't work. We create a child-friendly definition for each word. It's really important to do this up front because you will not be able to think about this on the fly. And then we create word picture cards. We chose to not use the same pictures as are in the books, but if we had to do it over again, we probably would would select pictures from the books as we needed to. So let's go through the next step is selecting the target words and definitions. I do suggest that you choose a combination of different kinds of words, nouns, verbs, adjectives. There's a temptation to use nouns because they're so easy to depict on the word cards, but children don't learn verbs or adjectives, so it's important to choose those as well. If you're working with signing children, it's really important to decide on the signs that you're going to use for the words and to try and use specific signs, because remember, our eventual goal is that children are going to learn to read. And when they recognize these words in the books, when somebody signs them or they sign it themselves, they're going to recognize that word as an English word that has a particular meaning. So it's important not to go with very broad signs that might be used for many different English words. You do have to decide which words should be fingerspelled. For young children, we don't want to choose too many fingerspelled words, and we don't want to hold them responsible for fingerspelling very long words, but we do want some fingerspelled words. And as I said, you develop the child-friendly definitions before you start teaching. So here are some examples of words that we chose. I'm going to take everything from our unit on bats. We chose this unit because it was in I think the first, they're science units that are designed for first and second grade, and we simply asked teachers, what are you not going to teach? And then we taught the units that they were not going to teach. So here are our words and definitions. Hang is really a tier. What we did, I forgot to mention this, and I will mention it now. We created lists of words. When we chose the words, we created what we called our A list, our B list, and our C list, with our A list being mostly tier 1 words, but not all, but words that we thought were simple and that many children might already know. Our B list is a little bit higher level words, and our C list is a little higher level than that. Our C list included a couple of tier 3 words, but we tried to have tier 2 words on all of our lists, and this is so that we could select a particular lexicon for each child that they did not know. And so we started screening with our A-level words and went on to B-level words. So hang was an A-level word, and you can see that our definition, our child-friendly definition, is holding on to something. Branch and thumb are B-level words in our system, and branch is the small part of a tree that grows out of the trunk. Thumb is the shortest finger on your hand. You notice that it's fingerspelled because otherwise children just point to their thumb, and they're not going to recognize that word in English if they don't ever see it fingerspelled. Fluttering was a level, a C-level word, and it is also fingerspelled. And as you could see, the definition is wings moving really fast. We really had to put a lot of thought into the words, how we signed them, how we signed the definitions, how we said the definitions, which words are fingerspelled, right? So that's a key piece of what we do. The first activity is called a fast mapping activity. And in this activity, it's pretty simple, and you'll be surprised at how well it works. What we put out is 3 pictures, 2 known, so in this case, the spoon and the carrot are known words, and the branch is the unknown word. So we put out 3 pictures, we say to the child, which is the branch? And most children will pick it out because they know the carrot, they know the spoon, and they know that the unknown word is branch. So what we do then is we ask them, how did you know that? And if they can't tell us, we give them the words for that. We give them the language for that. You know this is a carrot and this is a spoon, so this must be the branch. Why do we do this? We want children to develop a strategy for word learning, because the fast mapping strategy, basically the theory is, and we've shown it in many research studies, is that children take a new word and they attach it to the concept that they don't know. They learn the idea that new words go with new concepts. And so we want our deaf and hard of hearing children to learn this particular strategy, which is why we point out the strategy if they can't tell us. And later we even ask them, well, how did you know that? And I have to tell you that most of the kids did really well after the first unit. They were able to tell us what strategy they used. The second piece of the intervention is interactive book reading. You remember we talked about having two books, one narrative and one expository. We read each book twice because the books have the vocabulary in them. Now, not each book has all the vocabulary, but we try to select, we selected the vocabulary from the books. We stop at various points and ask what are called competence, abstract, and relate questions, and I will show you those questions in a minute. And we also draw attention to the new words while we're reading the book. So the teacher is reading the book to the child. She stops at various points that she's marked and planned out to ask these questions. And at the same time, while she's reading, she might draw attention to the new words using the word cards that were used in the fast mapping activity. Here are some examples of the questions. Competence questions are questions that come from the book. So you might ask, where is the mother bat sleeping? Because there's a picture of the mother bat sleeping. And the child can point or answer the question, and we will expand the answer. An abstract question is one where inferences need to be made. So an example is, what do you think the bat will do while it's flying? The child, we haven't read about that yet, so the child has to make an inference. And relate questions are questions that are related to their own experience. So we've talked, the book talks about bats eating fruit. We might ask the child, what kind of fruit do you like to eat? So we don't ask too many questions during book reading because otherwise it becomes kind of a test for the child. So we limit our questions to 2 per book reading, and you don't ask the same questions over and over again, and you're not looking for correct answers. You're looking for the child to be engaged in the book reading. So you don't stop everything while they're searching for answers. You help them with the answers. The idea is to get them, as I said, involved in the book reading. The next piece of it is conversation. And conversation provides an opportunity for the student and the teacher to use target words and to express the concepts. It provides opportunities for the teacher to model complex language, and it provides opportunities for the teacher to expand students' language. So we, in the original intervention, these conversations are standalone conversations. The teacher actually has a time for conversation with each child. But we found that it's easier to engage in conversations during the book reading or, for example, during the extension activities that I'll talk about. Conversation, we found, is actually the most difficult piece of all because the tendency is for teachers to ask questions and then get one-word answers from children. So we've learned to use different conversation moves. Here are the conversation moves that we think are productive. Open-ended questions that elicit more than one-word answers. And the example of that is, well, why do you think the bats eat the bugs? And then you can engage in conversation about why bats eat bugs. Statements. And we find that statements encourage other statements. We've taken this work, we've taken these moves from the work of an author called Wood, and I'll provide this for you in the reference list. So adult statements tend to elicit child statements. So if you say, I like the little bats best, what's the child likely to say? He'll say, oh no, I like the big bats. So you get a conversation moving out there. Adult acknowledgments are simply saying, yes, I hear you, you're right. And it encourages the child to continue talking, because what it's telling the child is, she is listening to me. And then finally, expansions or recasts, where you actually expand the child's language. And I know that many of you have learned this in your teacher preparation programs. The student says, I know like bugs. And the teacher expands that to, you don't like bugs. She might also expand it to, you don't like bugs because they sting you. So you not only expand it grammatically, but you also add ideas to that sentence. And what this does for the child, again, is tell them that you, as a teacher, are really listening to them. So that encourages them to talk more. And then you can bring in opportunities to use some of the new words so that the children get exposed to them more, and they also have an opportunity to use it themselves. Then finally, we have extension activities. We've come up with two kinds of extension activities. One is drill and practice, and that is not a bad word, provided you can keep children interested. This provides repeated opportunities for practice and gives, it's important though that the drill and practice give children not only receptive opportunities to hear or see the word, but also opportunities to use the word. And then conceptual extension activities that extend and enrich the concepts. And these provide opportunities to use the words in context and actually to also engage in those conversations that I talked about. Here are some drill and practice examples. We use memory and lotto games. One partner says the word, and the other partner has to find the right card from a number of face-down cards. So one partner is the teacher, and the other partner is the child. Another drill and practice example is one partner provides a definition and the other finds the appropriate word card. You know, we have board games where you can move a number of moves if you find the right card, for example. So you can make up these games. I know you all will have lots of ability to do that. And then the conceptual activity examples. For example, for the bats unit, one of our conceptual activities was eating a mango because bats like juicy fruits, and one of our words was mango. So, and the kids all thought it was a peach, so we thought we should bring in a mango, and the teacher and the student peel and cut a mango and eat it. And we know for that child, mango was definitely in her vocabulary and stayed in there for a long time. We created a bat collage where you have all these cutouts of bats and the fruit and the bugs they eat and the trees they hang from at night. And, you know, they create this collage, and that gives you an opportunity to talk about all these pieces and also, you know, which are related to the vocabulary we're teaching. And for them to also talk about the pieces. So, what are we finding? How effective is this vocabulary intervention? Because, you know, we're all researchers, and we won't take anybody's word for it that this is effective. We really need to know. So what we did for our first study, and I'll have more data at another time, I'm just going to use a case study example at this time, is we taught 5 words. This is the bats, well, it's actually several units. We taught, for each unit, we taught 5 words using the fast mapping, interactive book reading, conversation, drill and practice extension activities, and conceptual extension activities. Basically, we used all these activities to teach these words, but we think of that as being explicit teaching, because the fast mapping actually tells the children, here are the words you're going to learn, here are the new words. Whereas for the in-context words, we only use the interactive book reading, conversation, and conceptual activities. And in this, we didn't tell the kids, here are words you're going to learn. We wanted to see if they would learn the in-context words as well as they would learn the explicit words, because that's what a lot of children do. And if they can learn the in-context words, then maybe we don't have to be so explicit about teaching words. So now I have a graph for you, and I'm going to try and do some, oh, not quite yet. So here's the child I'm going to talk about. She's a female in 2nd grade and used only sign. And here's the graph. So what this graph shows is the results from our research, basically, for one child. What we have is we taught 3 units, right? The units are bats, moon, and dental health, even though you may not be able to see that. And we taught them in a staggered fashion. So we first taught bats. We tested to see whether they knew the words. And you could see that they did not know the words. On the y-axis are the number of words that they knew, and on the x-axis, down here, is the number of sessions. So we first take a baseline, and what we found for bats, we chose only words that the children didn't know. So we do a screening, and you could see that during baseline, this child only knew the 1 word. Most of the time, she did not. There are 2 different kinds of words, right? The triangles are the explicit words taught, and the squares are the in-context words taught. So then we started the teaching, and we assessed the children 3 times while we taught, and that is these 3 points. And then we assessed them 1 time at follow-up. That's that point that's not connected. So what are we seeing? What we're seeing is that in the first unit, bats, the children started off not knowing any of the 10 words. Well, this child, sorry, I keep talking about children, but this is only 1 child. Not knowing any of the 10 words, right? The explicit words are down at about 0, and the in-context words, the child clearly knew 1 of them. After the intervention, so this is taken during the intervention, so what we see is within 2 sessions, really 1 session of intervention, the child had already learned 5 of the explicitly taught words. She retained them the 2nd time, and the 3rd time around, she was able to know 4 of them. Whereas the words that were in context, that were not explicitly taught, she has 1 word, the same word clearly that she knew at baseline, and she went up to 2 words, but she didn't retain it, and she has 1 word at follow-up. Whereas the explicit words taught, she has 5 words at follow-up. The graph goes up to 6, but they could only get a maximum of 5. I just don't know how to make the graph clear if it doesn't go up to 6. Well, when you look at the moon unit, you see very much the same pattern. You see that the in-context words are learned, but she really learned only 3 of them and retained 3. Whereas the explicitly taught words, she learned 5 of them, really 4 of them, and retained 4, right? So you could see that. And then for dental health, you could see again at baseline, didn't know any of the words, but which is not surprising because we chose words that she didn't know. But you could see a little bit slower curve, but she's still learning all the words. This time she learned both. The reason you don't see a triangle and a square is they're both at the same level for assessment 2 and assessment 3. So this time she learned all 10 words. We don't have a follow-up on this child because, unfortunately, and by magic everything goes away. Unfortunately, the follow-up couldn't happen because Christmas break occurred. You'll notice my slide. We have the little call out there. Take 3 minutes to write down the 3 messages that you will take away from this presentation. So pause, write down your 3 messages, and we'll again meet on those on the discussion board. So here are my takeaway messages. Vocabulary can be caught, but it should also be taught, especially to children who are deaf and hard of hearing. Vocabulary teaching takes planning. Explicit instruction in vocabulary has positive outcomes. Successful vocabulary teaching for young deaf and hard of hearing children involves selecting the target words, developing child-friendly definitions, engaging in direct instruction, interactive book reading, and activities that allow the child to use the target words. We have pretty much determined that the direct instruction is the fastest way to teach children the words, but we also want them to learn from in-context instruction. The remaining slides are just resources for you to use, and then my references. So I will show them to you, but you don't need to do anything about them.